Welcome everyone to the Spring Jane Jacobs Lecture Series from the Center for the Living City. The Center for the Living City was launched by a group of activists, practitioners, and academics in 2005. The Center for the Living City holds the singular distinction of being the only urbanist organization founded in collaboration with Jane Jacobs. Our mission is to inspire civic engagement and leadership, invite creative urban solutions, and expand the understanding of the ecology of cities. Today, we are coming to you from two locations. We are live at Marywood University's School of Architecture, located in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and the home of Jane Jacobs. Thank you, Marywood School of Architecture, for being one of our sponsors. We're also coming to you live from Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Also, Columbia's Climate School Center for Sustainable Urban Development. Both schools are being sponsored by Northeastern Pennsylvania's American Institute of Architecture. Thank you, NEPA AIA. So at Columbia, we have Gita Miha, a member of the Center for the Living Cities Board. Gita is an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. She has worked on design projects in over 12 countries in Asia, Europe, South America, and Africa. She is also the president of Asia Initiatives, a nonprofit organization she founded in 1999. Thank you, Gita, so much for helping facilitate this collaboration between our universities. So before we start with our guest speaker, Gita is going to introduce him, but I have some housekeeping to take care of. So this lecture will run for approximately 45 minutes, and during the questions, please drop in your questions in the Q&A. So Gita is going to introduce Arvind, then she and I will disappear and Arvind will take over, and then we'll join you again at the end for questions and answers. Gita, thank you from Scranton to Columbia. Hi.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
So it's a great honor to introduce Arvind today. He's a lawyer and currently the Executive Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at New York City Housing Authority, where he oversees the agency's transformative efforts, including the restructuring of the authority, the NYCHA, and exploration of new business models to sustain the agency's core mission of housing low-income New Yorkers. He's an advocate for residential decision-making and has led several reforms to empower local control that better serves resident needs. He's actively developing several projects to explore the program's extensive history, challenging it with the reality of the residents' experience today. Arvind joined the Housing Authority after several years as a consultant with McKinsey & Company, where he served a variety of private and public sector clients, including movie studios, television networks, government agencies, and nonprofits. He also worked as a McKinsey Global Institute Fellow and co-authored the 2016 paper, The U.S. Economy, an Agenda for Inclusive Growth. So he has a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and a JD from Harvard Law School. He serves on the board of the Center for the Living City that is hosting the event today. So let's welcome Arvind, please.
Thank you. First, I want to thank both Geetha and Maria for those generous introductions. Also wanted to second my thanks to Columbia and Marywood and the IA for sponsoring this event. Just gonna make sure everyone can see my screen real quick. Okay, there we go. So my name is Arvind Sohoni. I'm the Executive Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at the New York City Housing Authority. The Housing Authority owns and operates 170,000 public housing apartments in New York City, housing around 500,000 New Yorkers. As part of my work, which is mostly forward-looking, I've spent a lot of time thinking backwards about how exactly it is that we got here. How is it that 90 years into this great experiment on low-income housing, we have come so far and yet perhaps moved nowhere at all? It is a particular honor to deliver a lecture named for Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs was my introduction to urbanism. 10 years ago, I moved to New York. I picked up a copy of The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and that book changed my life. In those pages, I found the words for feelings that I had had, for thoughts that I had had, all with a specificity and a depth that I could not imagine formulating myself. It remains, I think, the single greatest descriptive book on cities, and beyond that, perhaps the greatest book on the pedagogy of cities, the best way to learn how it is to see and to observe cities. Jacobs wrote that the way to get at what goes on in the seemingly mysterious and perverse behavior of cities is, I think, to look closely at the most ordinary scenes and events and attempt to see what they mean and whatever any threads of principle emerge among them. That is certainly how I learned New York, and certainly how I learned the New York City Housing Authority. Jane Jacobs was very critical of public housing in New York. I think it's a very fair place for us to start this discussion. She wrote that these were centers of delinquency, vandalism, and general social hopelessness that were worse than the slums they actually eradicated. If you think about the four Jacobsian principles of street diversity, and we'll use those as a proxy for some sort of urban vitality today, public housing as designed in New York violates basically every one of those principles. So mixed uses to encourage differentiation of times and purposes on the street, short blocks to allow for cross use, buildings of different ages and conditions, and sufficient density to allow sort of nonstop drumbeats of activity. Public housing in New York fails all four of those dimensions in how it was built. Primarily single use, residential use only, very little commercial space on those campuses, massive super blocks, often superimposed on top of the city grid, no variation in age or condition within the sites generally, and lower density than the city as a whole. Jacobs wrote about density in terms of dwellings per acre. We now think about this largely in people per acre, but there is a lot of conflation and confusion around density and overcrowding, which we'll get into in a second. On top of all of that, these sites were built as these very insular islands. They faced inward. They had their own community centers, their own services, their own neighborhoods built within them. They were designed to cut residents off from other parts of the city. Based on our principles, Jacobs had no option but to object to public housing. This is the only logical conclusion of her beliefs, to say the system was not going to work. But Jacobs was also deeply distrustful of institutions and of central planning. And obviously public housing was in many ways the epitome of central planning by institutions. Vibrancy alone, though, is not the only requirement for a city. Cities require people, and those people need to live somewhere, and ideally live somewhere at some level of affordability. The most eloquent writer on housing affordability in the 20th century, I think, was a woman named Catherine Bauer. Bauer and her colleagues like Clarence Stein, Edith Elmer Wood, Lewis Mumford were the intellectual heirs of the 19th century theories of Henry George, Patrick Geddes, Ebenezer Howard. Jane Jacobs was very critical of this band of decentrists, as she called them. Bauer wrote a book called Modern Housing in 1934, where she looked at the conditions of the housing market in the 1930s and said, the private market is not going to house these people. The city is unwilling or unable to house about the bottom third of New York households based on income. And so she believed there was a role for central planning in solving that issue, an active role for the state in housing that had to be used to address the specific housing issue. She also had an expansive view of state power and wanted a much more European model where the state housing a much bigger swath of people than public housing ever came to actually house in the end. Fundamentally, I believe Bauer was right. Bauer was right to look at the conditions in the 1930s and say this was the only option forward about housing this population. I also, though, believe Jacobs was right in her view of vibrancy and her rubric for what takes or what it takes to create vibrant street diversity. These two are trying to solve two different questions. Jane Jacobs was solving for a sustainability and urban vitality in the long term. Catherine Bauer was solving for a short-term need to house somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million people in New York. This lecture is not really about Jane Jacobs versus Catherine Bauer. Both have since passed. Both were brilliant in their own ways. But I want to keep this tension in mind as we get into the history of the Housing Authority, this tension of vitality and affordability, and this question of can the affordable living city actually exist? I never know where to start this story, but I'm going to pick the 1850s today. So we're going to start in Manhattan in the 1850s. At the time of the Revolution, New York had about 25,000 people in it. About 1790 onward, the city grows, basically triples every 30 years. So exponential growth in population starting in 1790. And that raises questions around things like density and crowding and proximity, questions that had not really plagued the city prior to that time. This is the commissioner's grid from 1811. This is the grid that still exists in Manhattan. One off-topic point about this, there were arguments at the time, actually they should have flipped this grid around and had the avenues running the other direction, because right now these blocks actually hide from the sunlight. So many of the mid blocks of Manhattan actually get very little sunlight in lower buildings because of the way this is laid out. It's too late now, but a thing they perhaps should have thought about back in 1811. This is the first era, though, where these questions come up. Questions of housing. How do we house people at scale? This is really when that question begins. The neighborhood where this became the most prominent question was a place called the Five Points. This is a neighborhood that is now where the courthouses are in downtown Manhattan. This was where the movie Gangs of New York, the book Gangs of New York, originally was based on this neighborhood. Built on top of a contaminated pond. There was a pond called the Collect that was next to a bunch of tanneries and slaughterhouses. They covered it up, built this neighborhood. As you can imagine, a lot of disease because of that, very low land values, very dangerous in the end, very violent, a lot of sort of social challenges in this neighborhood. Perhaps the first true American slum at some scale in this country. It also became something of a macabre tourist destination too. In 1842, Charles Dickens, fresh off the success of Oliver Twist, comes to New York for a 6-month tour. He goes to the Five Points with 2 police escorts and walks around some of the buildings that he sees. And he writes that from every corner, as you glance about you in these dark retreats, some figure crawls here awakened, as if the judgment hour were near at hand, and every obscene grave were giving up its dead, where dogs would howl to lie, women and men and boys slink off to sleep, forcing the dislodged rats to move away in quest of better lodgings. Dickens, I think needless to say, was not a huge fan of our fair city. The conditions, to be fair to Dickens and to others, were not great at the Five Points or in any other parts of the city at this time. These were oftentimes unrelated families living in close, dark quarters in single rooms, often kids with no parents living alone in these rooms. Kids without access to sunlight would develop rickets in their legs, so their legs would bow outward. These were also very flammable buildings. These are mostly wooden structures. Fatal fires were not uncommon in the 1850s, and sadly for many years later, still not uncommon in many parts of New York, unfortunately. 2 threads of housing policy come out of this era in the mid-19th century. One is the instinct to regulate housing in some form. Can we pass enough laws, enough regulations to curtail the worst excesses of these buildings? This led to the Tenement House Acts in the late 1800s, each act adding more requirements to buildings. This is all prospective. This is all about future construction. And because of that, the acts were very limited in their effect. Right? The acts did not require owners to retroactively change their buildings. This was all prospective. Also, developers were very creative. So they would say in one of the Tenement House Acts, every bedroom needs a window. And they would build windows of two buildings adjoining to each other that faced each other. You could not open the windows. They would come back 12 years later and say, actually, what we meant was windows that faced the sunlight in some form or another. So they built the dumbbell tenements that have these air shafts with sunlight that became basically trash chutes that you could not clean over time. If you look at the right side of this chart, those structures still exist in many parts of New York, on the Lower East Side and East Harlem and parts of Brooklyn and the Bronx. The dumbbell, sort of the second to the right, still does exist. You can, if you go on a walking tour and look at some of the older buildings in the city, and then look them up on the city planning website, you can figure out based on the age which one of these it probably is. So there were a lot of limitation in the effectiveness of the regulation path. The second thread was a supply side impulse. So the admission that this was not just a regulation challenge, but there was a need to actually add more supply to the system. And so they built these things called model tenements. The first model tenement was built in 1855. This lasted for about 10 to 15 years in that format before it got sold off. It was reopened as a women's housing complex, eventually became a private complex in the late 1800s. The workman's home had a lot of the same challenges you hear about today in developments of very poor construction standards causing long-term issues. So the plumbing would freeze in the wintertime, the toilets on the upper floors would freeze. Eventually they couldn't use the bathrooms upstairs. They had to come walk downstairs to the first two floors and use the toilets in the closets. And again, even if these had worked quite well on their own, they were limited in scale. These were all funded by individual family foundations, more or less, none of whom could actually afford to build this in a sufficient way to actually change the system overall. Around this time, though, you do start to see this increasing drumbeat of asks for city involvement in housing. This question of, can the city be actually the landlord of some of these places? And this was around the same time that people like Teddy Roosevelt, both in New York and then eventually in DC, were asking the same question about public housing. So the program was not a new concept by the time it actually came about during the Depression. I want to emphasize just how much effort they put in to avoid public housing existing in the city. Public housing was considered the last resort to this problem. And so they tried basically everything else they could, including what was known as limited dividend. So this was a state program originally built in 1926, and it guaranteed a certain level of profit to investors. On the left side here, you'll see the amalgamated co-op. This is in the Bronx, just south of Van Cortlandt Park, built by the Clothing Workers Union, still exists today. In the middle, the federal RFC also did the same kind of program, building a couple sites on the Lower East Side. On the right side is actually a site that does not exist in reality, but almost did exist. This is actually between Christie and Forsyth Streets on the Lower East Side. This is now Senator Roosevelt Park. But when Jimmy Walker was mayor in the late 20s, he proposed a quasi-public housing site on that land. And again, it was limited because it was going to be financed by a private philanthropic effort. And that person eventually pulled out. I will say, I won't get distracted by Jimmy Walker today, but if you, after this lecture, spend 15 minutes Googling Jimmy Walker, the most fascinating person ever be, mayor of the city, and also bizarrely progressive on housing issues. At the same time that New York was sort of fiddling on the edges of the housing question in Europe, housing palaces, and named Louis Pink, I'll talk about more in a second, went to Europe. He went to Vienna and Berlin and Cologne, and he studied what they were doing. And he wrote a great book called The Challenge of Housing in 1927. And he said, if they're doing this, why can't we? So the first example of the why can't we have nice things in New York argument. Why is everyone else doing these things ahead of us? Vienna in particular was interesting because after World War I, it had gone from the seat of this giant empire to the seat of this fairly people. They made a choice to say, we're going to boost exports to raise incomes. To boost exports, they said, we're going to keep input costs very low, keep labor costs very low, to do that, we're going to make housing basically as cheap as possible to house workers. When Pink went to Vienna, he said, Vienna has killed the landlord in order to save the worker. A slogan that I hope someday someone can pick up and use for some good. Catherine Bauer got a lot of her inspiration from too. Bauer was very moved by the buildings that were built in Vienna and other places. And again, these were not as targeted at what they considered low-income households. This is a pretty broad swath of population eligible for these buildings. And that is still true in large parts of Europe and other parts of the world. Public housing is not seen as a low-income housing program. It is just housing. And that is a very different way of thinking about it, and a very different way of thinking about the politics of that math as well. The math in New York changes during the Depression, partially because the unemployment crisis obviously exacerbates the housing crisis, and proximity and visibility of poverty all of a sudden has changed. Just like the 5 points, which again was a story about visibility of poverty being in the faces of the sort of ruling class types in New York, it was a similar story during the Depression. This is Central Park, this picture here. These are the sort of wooden shacks built. Central Park West is along the top side of the picture there. You had very wealthy people living now all of a sudden close to very poor people. And that changes the mentality of some of the folks, both in office and in a place to influence policy. There were several attempts in the late 20s, early 30s to pass public housing legislation. All of them failed. It wasn't really until 1933, 34 where that took on a lot of momentum. At the end of 33, LaGuardia becomes mayor. LaGuardia had been the first sort of non-Tammany mayor in quite some time. And he made housing a very central part of his campaign platform, also of his mayoralty. Prior to his winning even, he had sent a young lawyer named Charles Abrams to Albany to help work on this legislation to create housing authorities across the state. Eventually, that law is passed at the beginning of 34. Governor Lehman signs it in February of 34. The city quickly adopts it and creates the housing authority locally. This is the first board of the housing authority here. I'll go through them all very quickly. They're all fascinating people. They deserve their own lectures individually, but they'll get a minute here apiece, I think. In the middle, Langdon Post was the first chair of the authority. He was 34. When appointed, had been in the state assembly for a long time. I had worked under the Roosevelt administration for about 6 months, ran against he ran for borough president and lost, and was sort of a socialite about town, married to a very famous woman himself, was in the papers for his work and for his sort of banquets and other sort of going-ons about town. To his left, Charny Vladek was a Russian revolutionary. Vladek had been chased around by the Tsar in Russia, had been jailed a few times, escapes to London. He meets Lenin and Trotsky in London, gets to the US, becomes a lecturer around the Eastern Seaboard, eventually elected to the city council in New York as a socialist in 1917. Above him was Louis Pink, who I mentioned, longtime government and insurance executive in the States. To his right, Reverend Moore, who was the head of the Catholic Charities program, also ran St. Peter's Church in downtown Manhattan for a long time. Staunch conservative on social issues, but on housing was quite a progressive. And bottom right, Mary Simkovich, who, along with Bauer, was probably the other influential person in the Housing Act of 37. So Catherine Bauer and Mary Simkovich really were the two people most influential in housing policy in the 1930s. Close friends of the Roosevelts, very much running in those circles around that time. I will point out when the Housing Authority started, this was front page news, right? This was considered a big deal. This was front page of the New York Times basically every day for the first 3 or 4 months the agency existed. Once they had the agency in place, they had to go do something. They wanted to demolish tenements, build new buildings, but they had no money. And this is a theme that continues, sadly, to today. LaGuardia, for all of his talk about public housing during the campaign, did almost nothing in the first couple of years to support the agency. No city money was given to the authority. There basically was very little support from any level of government early on. Eventually, Langdon Post, in his brilliance with his brain trust, decides to hold a brick sale to keep the agency open. They were demolishing so many tenements, they had these bricks piled up. They said, let's sell bricks to raise money. And it was enough, even in the midst of a depression, to keep the doors open at the agency. It wasn't enough money, though, to actually use for construction financing. You could operate with that brick money, but not really build anything with it. The authority had been originally created on this promise of $25 million from Harold Ickes, who was Roosevelt's Interior Secretary, who had said cities would get this money to build these social housing complexes. Ickes disappears once the authority is created. Post wrote later on that it was Ickes' fear of ghosts that scared him away from the program early on. Post eventually went to Ickes' rival, Harry Hopkins, and the administration, who decides to fund this first site. The site was actually owned originally by Vincent Astor. So the Astor family had owned these tenements on the Lower East Side, and they'd been sort of shamed into selling them because of these headlines about this rich family owning fire traps across the city. Astor sells the site to the housing authority. They eventually build the first houses, which still exist today. I do want to just quickly go back to the Bauer and Jacobs conversation on this. If you think about the way this manifested in 1935-36, if you read Jane Jacobs at her word, her approach to this kind of slum, if you would call it that, was what she called unslumming. So slow investments in these neighborhoods that over time regenerate and basically change the nature of the neighborhood. Bauer's view leads you to saying something else: demolish it, rebuild it. NYCHA, obviously, in the early days, is following the Catherine Bauer method of regenerating neighborhoods. That is sort of who has won out in this moment in the 1930s. I will also point out one of the first things that the Housing Authority did when building this site was to lie to the federal government. The feds would not pay for new construction, only rehabilitation. They knew they couldn't actually rehabilitate the site. They lied about it, and Hopkins paid the money anyway. After the first site was built, Ickes reappears with his promise of $25 million. They built Harlem River and Williamsburg. Harlem River for Black families, Williamsburg for white families, very explicitly so. These are two of the better designed sites in the portfolio. Both are now being converted to private developers because of lead paint issues, but otherwise, actually, these were built quite well for their time. This is Williamsburg. And this is LaGuardia and Robert Wagner in the corner there, laying the cornerstone. All of this was prior to the federal public housing program even existing, right? So all of that work that had happened to this point was before the Housing Act was even passed. So New York had been an early mover, but perhaps not the first mover. Atlanta and Milwaukee also had these big social housing programs in the late 20s, early 30s. The Housing Act, though, was the first statement that the feds were going to be in this game for a long time. This was going to be an actual program of federal money being used for slum clearance and for new construction. The Housing Act, though, while it did provide a lot of money for this program, it also entrenched one of the great tensions of public housing in this country, is that this is the first time when homeownership becomes sort of the American ideal of housing. And to this day, we still forego $70 billion a year in the mortgage interest tax deduction and spend obviously far less than that on most public housing or Section 8 or any kind of rental assistance programs. So the Housing Act does create this program. It also does entrench a lot of the tension that I think causes problems for us today. The Housing Act creates the U.S. Housing Authority, run by a man named Nathan Strauss, who had been an heir to the Macy's fortune. You'll notice a lot of the people in this story in this era were heirs to fortunes. There was a sense that housing reform was a rich person's game, right? This was the sort of noble class of New Yorkers coming down to reform and change the tenements in the slum areas. So it's not uncommon to see people like Strauss and others involved in this story. In this era, they built places like Queensbridge, Red Hook, Vladeck, low coverage, low rise, relatively low density, a lot of open space. The agency was pretty sophisticated at the time in its architecture and its approach to sunlight and to wind patterns and to configurations. And again, the sophistication is one thing, but they had assumed that the outcome they wanted was to maximize things like sunlight and open space. Their dependent variable they were trying to maximize were things like that. And so everything they tried to manipulate was designed to maximize those things. If you were someone like Jacobs, you'd object to that being the right outcome necessarily for these spaces. That might not be the right thing you're trying to solve for. But that was very much the way these folks at the time thought about the goals they were trying to achieve. Similarly, on density, these sites were not very dense, but the agency was very sophisticated in thinking about density and configurations of sites and how you get to certain numbers of density across the portfolio. Most of the housing authority sites are between 150 to 250 people per acre. That's about half to a third of what Jacobs generally wrote was the ideal in her mind. So again, a very different view of what the city is built to be and built for. Just another example of sort of sunlight analysis. This obsession with sunlight is what led someone like Louis Mumford to write that wealthy New Yorkers living in brownstones were living in slums but didn't know it. So Mumford wrote this whole thing about that brownstones were actually slums, and these people didn't know they were living in slums, which Jacobs openly mocked in her first book. But again, this was the sort of the dominant view of the day of this is what you're trying to maximize in these complexes. I want to use one example of a site that we're going to run through the Jacobs rubric of street diversity against this one example of Red Hook houses. And I have also the pleasure of my great friend, Karen Blondell, the resident leader of Red Hook West, being in the room here too. So Red Hook was built in 1939. It was one of the U.S. Housing Authority sites, 3,000 apartments across now 2 different developments. And let's go through these 4 different pieces that Jacobs would have liked to see in a city. Mixed use. Red Hook has very little non-residential space. You can see kind of in this picture on the top right there, there are 3 storefronts on that one corner. It's about all the commercial space within the complex at this time, and also underutilized, I think most people would say. Small blocks. These are actually massive blocks. You can see that both Henry and Hicks Streets have been actually removed for pedestrian walkways. But because there's no mixed use, there's not a lot of actual foot traffic in those places at all times of the day. Mixed age, not really. These are all built around the same time, with one exception of the sort of the taller building on the west end of the campus. And density, again, quite low. You're talking about 130 to 150 people per acre in Red Hook, which again is quite low for the city in general, and certainly quite low for what Jacobs would have preferred. On top of that, the site is very insular facing, right? The entrances to the buildings are inside courtyards. You have to walk around the street entrance to get to sort of a middle courtyard to get into the building itself. It's a very intimidating place to walk around if you don't know where you're going. You can get lost quite easily if you're not from the area or don't spend a lot of time in the area. And I will say it's gotten even worse, I think, since Hurricane Sandy, with the extensive construction work going on there. You've got these piles of dirt and the shedding and the fences up that are making it even harder to sort of really maintain any kind of vitality or vibrancy in the development. Once you get past this era, sort of in the early 40s, construction stops during the war. Obviously, the war effort was the primary focus for federal funding, but there were plans for housing after the war. The state was making plans for how to invest in housing once the war was done. Once the state does step in, this is when Robert Moses appears on the scene. Moses effectively runs the housing authority from afar for about a decade. Never officially works the housing authority, but effectively picks the chair, picks the vice chair, is running the show for quite some time. The state sites were built for a couple of purposes. One, to house veterans returning from war, but then later on to house people being displaced by the various projects that Moses wanted to pursue. So the highway projects, different parks, he had to put them somewhere. This became a place where you could put those residents. The example on the screen is from Gowanus. On the top left side, you'll see this is what we demolished. We demolished brownstones and small multifamily complexes, and we built this on the right. So true tower in the park. Again, this area, you're building a little bit higher up, higher density than the early sites. But again, maximizing open space, maximizing sunlight in a way that was sort of a choice they made along the way. The city also had its own program. They built for different populations. They built for sometimes not wealthy New Yorkers, but wealthier New Yorkers. So the City 4 program in particular was built to assume no subsidies. It was built to actually pencil out with rents being high enough to pay for the entire both construction and maintenance of the program. If you go to these sites today, you can actually tell some of the choices that were made, that they were actually higher fixtures and higher finishes at some of the city sites versus the state sites of the portfolio. The federal government does re-enter the picture in the late 40s. Truman was the first candidate for president to talk about rental housing as a campaign issue. Obviously, Roosevelt played a huge role in the program beginning, but Truman was the first to sort of use as a campaign issue at some length. The Housing Act of 49 committed to building 810,000 public housing units by 1955. That number was met, but it was met in 1975. The reason being the war in Korea. Wars have a way from distracting from domestic policies sometimes. And so despite Truman's best efforts, this number did not get there quite as fast as he wanted to. Title III of the 49 Act was the one that funded public housing. One example was St. Nicholas. This is actually about not too far from here at Columbia, sort of in central Harlem. Again, we demolished the site on the left, a series of brownstones and multifamily housing to build the site on the right. Again, towers in the park, a lot of open space, and you're seeing sort of this trend of taller and taller buildings. NYCHA over time does get taller and taller and slightly more dense as the program continues. While we think of public housing in New York as one single program today, it was not one program. In fact, it was several programs built between these different entities. And so the rents were very different by entity too. In this era, rents were not set at household income. They were set to cover the cost of the unit. And so if the unit was more expensive to build, the rents were high enough to cover the cost to maintain that unit. So a state site may be rented at about half the cost of a City 4 site. So a family living at St. Mary's Park in the Bronx, moving down the street to Patterson houses, may pay half as much if they make that move, no matter what their income profile says. With all these programs running concurrently, you have this incredible construction boom after the war. So for 20 years, the agency is building between 6,000 and 8,000 units every single year. That is a pace the city had not seen before. We will probably sadly never see it again, despite many of our best wishes. In 1950 alone, they opened 14,000 apartments in the housing authority. Interest rates were low. NYCHA was a very smart dollar in this era. So this was a real sort of moment. Again, part of this, the first half of that window is the Moses era, but it continues past Moses as well. I want to show, I love showing these pictures because, you know, in the spirit of observation that Jane Jacobs would have wanted, and I can't take you all to a housing authority site right now, and it's worth seeing what life was like at these places when they were still growing. So I'll just go quickly around the horn here. Top left is actually, it's Lou Alcindor, who became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He was with the chair of the housing authority doing a basketball camp. You've got a young couple getting the key to their apartment. The man handing the key is Frank Crosswaith, the first Black board member at NYCHA. You got moving day at Douglas Houses, moving day at, I think that's Brownsville in the bottom left, and then Woodside in the middle, and Vladeck at the bottom right. The reason I show this is that it's important to remember a key to a housing authority apartment in this era was an enormous victory. This was a huge win for families that could not always afford to live other places in the city. This was considered a real step up. This is a real way forward for these families and a real win for them at the time. The authority continues to build into the 60s. This is the era of urban renewal, model cities, which are slightly different programs, but had sort of adjacent timelines. Places like Fulton houses. So again, denser sites, taller sites, more infill sites. So we're building one-off towers now in certain campuses. So again, over time, NYCHA is going from sort of this very low level, low rise, spread out campuses to these much more dense, narrow, taller campuses. There weren't any more of these outlying outer borough vacant lots anymore to build on. They had to build like this to add more supply. So thus far, I've told mostly a growth story. This has been a very positive story. So the question is, where does it all go wrong? And the answer is right here. And these are charts from Mayor John Lindsay's testimony in front of the Senate Banking Committee in 1970. This is 54 years ago, and he's saying the housing authority is in trouble. He's saying we cannot survive with this business model right now. That chart is showing you that expenses are growing at a rate that rents could not keep up with. And so again, this is 54 years ago. You've got the mayor of New York saying this program may not survive given the dynamics that we have in play. Labor costs were growing fast, debt service was growing fast. And so there were real signs of trouble even in the 1970s. This is a pencil drawn piece of paper I found in my office from the 1970s. You can't really entirely read the whole thing. The reason this is important, though, is so in 1969, the federal government changed the laws on rent calculations. So the rents went from being based on the cost of the unit to being based on household income. For some cities like St. Louis and Chicago, that was a catastrophic change because all of a sudden the revenues plummeted. It wasn't as big of a problem for New York initially because New York's public housing residents were generally wealthier than other cities' public housing residents. Over time, though, that has become an enormous challenge. What this chart is showing you, if you can see kind of the top middle part of it, the residents that were paying not at the 25% cap because they were already below it, were paying about $92 a month in rent at this time. The ones who had hit the cap were paying $42 a month in rent. As more residents over time started to hit that cap because of income constraints, rents started to plummet at the housing authority, especially when you normalize for inflation. This is still a huge challenge to the business model today. If you're looking for a political turning point in the housing authority story, it's this one at Forest Hills. So John Lindsay and Simeon Goler, who was the chair at the time, they decided to go build these scattered sites in other parts of the city. This is the new federal push on housing to go build in other parts of the city. The homeowners in Forest Hills revolt. They hire a young lawyer named Mario Cuomo to come fight this push. The housing authority wins this battle in the end. This site does exist. It's still there today. But this becomes a perception challenge of the housing authority being Black and brown residents moving into white homeowner neighborhoods. This becomes the new fight that the housing authority is waging on a PR front, at least. And you can see the effects of this on the back end of the demographics. NYCHA was majority white in 1955. By 1985, it was below 13% white. Today, it's about 4% white. And I will point out, until the 90s, they only counted white, Black, and Puerto Rican. So this is a very not entirely accurate view of the world at the time either. You cannot disentangle the political outcomes of this program from this fact. And the story is often told without this being part of the narrative. I think it's a really important part of the narrative. The fact that the political outcomes of this program trace this chart almost one-to-one is not an accident. I think it's a very explicit part of the story that we have to grapple with. Into the 1980s, you see more and more of a decline at the housing authority sites. The war on drugs, the crack epidemic, spikes in violence. I've had residents tell me that they lost an entire generation of young men in the 1980s to all of these issues that were going on at the time. And these were real social challenges within these campuses. but it also doubled down on that go through there in the city way or another. These pictures actually are both also from Red Hook in the 1980s. Behind all of that, what was going on was this rampant disinvestment of public housing. So Nixon had placed a moratorium on financing for new construction in 73. Subsidy cuts continued into the 80s after that. So think about this, you've told the Housing Authority in 69, all of a sudden you're gonna cap their rents at household income. And then you've said, actually, we're gonna also cut your subsidies too over time. You've got what is a explicitly by law installed changes today at housing today. And this again has been a challenge that we have faced for 30, 40 years and continue to face today. I would be remiss to say that's the only problem though, because behind that was also this organizational decline happening at the Housing Authority too. Beginning in the 80s and 90s, there were several signs of rot within the agency. And so you've got investigations and arrests. Vincent Gigante, who was the head of the Genovese crime family, gets arrested on a bid rigging scheme. They were controlling window contracts at the Housing Authority. They had tried to get this guy on any number of crimes for a long time, eventually get him for a NYCHA-related crime. And the reason I think this is important too is that, again, there's a version of the story that's told that NYCHA's problems are new. This is a recent challenge. These are not new. The funding challenges, the organizational challenges date back at least to the 80s, if not to the 70s. And so none of these things actually are really new things that we are dealing with. All of this, kind of see in the bottom right, leads to this moment in 2019 where NYCHA goes under a federal agreement with HUD and with the U.S. Attorney's Office. That's when I joined the agency about 10 days after that agreement was signed. So all of that leads to this question of what comes next. And I don't want to leave you on the depressing note of the business model being broken and all of these challenges that we face. There are basically three possible futures that I see here. One is that we continue as things are today. So the agency has a handful of tools at its disposal. We've got the PACT program, converting sites to private developers in partnership with the agency to do repairs. The Public Housing Trust, which was passed in 2022, doing that in a more public way with a new agency. There's one path that says those things continue. We keep doing that work as we go and see how far it gets us. I think that's one path. Maybe the most likely outcome is probably that one. There's a second path, which is what happened in Chicago and St. Louis and Philadelphia, where something goes wrong. Something happens, and that's what ended those programs in those cities. That is unlikely to happen here, I think, given some of the political support for the program in theory, but it is a fear that should exist around the program if there is not more funding for it or more support for it long term. The third, and the one that I would certainly advocate for, and certainly one that I think is most promising, is we innovate our way out of this problem in some way. The Housing Authority owns an incredible number of assets. We own 4% of all of Manhattan, which is not a thing that any other entity gets to actually own. If we believe in this mission of social housing, this is an important thing for us to be doing, we have to be creative in finding ways to self-subsidize that mission. For years, obviously, the program has been reliant on federal subsidies, the occasional state subsidy, the occasional state subsidy. We may have to think about a world in which the Housing Authority is doing more than just public housing. Are we doing other things that can actually fund these programs forever? Because we may be looking at a future where the federal government says at some point, we're not in this business anymore. And what happens then? And this is too important a program to leave in the hands, I think, of other people outside New York. And so I'll stop there. And I think if we do get the second bite of the apple, if we do get the chance to innovate in this program and to really think about a future that is more integrated, perhaps more mixed income, I think there's a world in which you can actually square some of this circle between Jane Jacobs and Catherine Bauer. You can take Bauer's view of state power and state authority and what she did with the Housing Authority and actually apply a lot of Jane Jacobs' views on things. These sites don't have to look like they do today. And so I'll stop there. I think this is worth fighting for. I think it's a future that is valuable to the city and valuable to the residents. But I will stop talking and happy to take questions and comments and all those things. Maria?
Arvind, can you hear me? Arvind? Can you hear me?
Here.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. That was so good. Thank you, Arvind. I have several questions in the chat here. Want me to throw some at you? Or do you have some live from Columbia? How would you want to do
Sure.
this? Okay, we'll
Yeah,
take,
let's go to the chat.
okay, we'll go to the chat. Can you say more about the past and future of mortgage interest tax considerations if you were heard properly as a deterrent / incentive to public housing investments?
Sure, it's a great point. If I ever run for office, I'll deny ever saying this about the tax deduction. It is a very popular program. I would say we spend a lot of money and forego a lot of tax revenue in incentivizing home ownership. And so again, $70 billion a year in taxes are foregone by the US government in promoting mortgages being taken on by homeowners. That is not a one-to-one pot of money that is being used for that versus public housing. But again, tax revenues and deferrals are limited by the overall pool of the US government's scale. And so there's been a choice made to prioritize home ownership programs, I think, over time in lieu of rental assistance in 1930 to that at some point in time, as you have younger people coming out of schools who can't afford to live basically anywhere and may not be in a place to buy a home at any point in their lives. There may be a new discussion to be had about rental assistance and rental housing being a much bigger part of the American view of housing. So it's not a one-to-one trade-off, but I think there's a philosophy that I think has been favored one over the other.
Great. Thank you, Arvind. Here's another one. If there are community spaces and green spaces within large buildings, could that bridge the gap and create more of the community that Jane Jacobs intended? And is there any way that this kind of building can create a minimum in its own community, at a minimum in its own community?
Yeah, I think that was the intent when they built those spaces. So the community centers that were built at the Housing Authority were designed to be those spaces for the residents of the complex. The challenge with that, again, this is my opinion, is that they were built for the residents in isolation from the city. So it wasn't designed necessarily for residents outside the Housing Authority to come in and interact with residents in some way. It was built just for those residents to stay very inward focused. And over time, those spaces have also deteriorated quite a bit. They're not used for the same things anymore. They're used for different kinds of programming. We've outsourced most of those spaces to other organizations. So I think, yes, that was the intent. But I think for public housing to work long-term, it can't just be about public housing residents with each other in these spaces. It's got to be, how do you integrate these spaces into the city more broadly? And these were never really built in that way.
Right. And to follow up that, these are mostly questions from students here at Marywood. So at this point, would the goal be to redesign the existing failed projects or start over with new projects?
Yeah, listen, I mean, if I could do both, that would be great. I think the idea of new construction has sort of been, new construction in public housing has not really been a thing that's been discussed in quite some time. It is still possible. So every housing authority operates under, Roth was a senator from North Carolina who sponsored an amendment in the 90s saying that you can't build public housing above this cap that you're at in 1999. We're actually 10,000 units below that cap in New York right now. So in theory, New York could build 10,000 more public housing units if the money were to appear at some point in time. That would be an amazing future if that money does appear. Most likely to do that, it's going to require some other components of that project, some other mixed use, market units, affordable units. I think that's probably the reality we're looking at. Honestly, given the sites that we have, we still own or operate 250 different developments. They all have specific needs to rehabilitate them. So we have to do both, I think, long term.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have lots of questions, Arvind. I'm going to try to get through as many as I could before we run out of time. Okay. here's a question. So it's so interesting that the New York City Housing Authority is discussing mixed income households when they just implemented a policy to remove higher income families from public housing via HOTMA, which displaces families and destabilizes the community at large. So does NYCHA intend to roll back that policy in order to honor the goal of organic mixed income households?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the question is referring to a thing called HOTMA, which is actually not, it's not a nice, it's a federal law that's imposed on housing authorities. And so it does require housing authorities to actually basically move to push out people that are over income from public housing sites. Personally, do I think that's a good idea? No, I think it's a terrible idea. I think it actually does, to the question's point, I think it harms the long-term development of the neighborhood to do that. But that was not NYCHA's choice, really. That was a federal law that was imposed on the housing authority. So yeah, that is, again, back to the point about the 70s and the 80s, a lot of the housing authority's limitations are us being chased by federal laws changing over time. There's only so much you can do if you're reliant on those subsidies. We have to follow those laws effectively.
Okay, thank you. Is there a program that can employ and train PH residents in the climate adaptation of the buildings and grounds of the PH stock? And then what are the pathways to ownership within PH public housing? So is there,
We still the last part.
Okay, is there a program that can employ and train public housing residents in the climate adaptation of the buildings and grounds? And then the last is, what are the pathways to ownership within public housing?
Yeah, so on the first, there are programs like that. They're fairly limited at this point in time. They exist. So we've had, given some of the more extensive construction work we have going on, especially some of the adaptation work, there are programs for residents to train on this. But again, I think they're not big enough probably for the scale of the place right now. On the second question, I think long-term, that is a thing we have to figure out. Right now, there is no path to ownership in public housing. There have been attempts in the past in certain developments because of certain federal programs to do that, to give residents a long-term path to actually own units or to convert buildings to co-ops over time. That's not really a possibility in the public housing program as designed today. But again, as the housing authority thinks more about its own future, perhaps not as reliant on federal money alone, I think that becomes a very interesting path. And to the prior question also, it's sort of, you get this much bigger spectrum of people being served by the agency, which is a much better political situation than it is today.
Right. Okay, I'll try to hit it one more here. Excuse me. Do you see New York City's Housing Authority PACT, PACT, as a Band-Aid solution or sustainable solution to desperately needed rehab? What do you think the future of the program will look like?
Yeah, so the person's asking about PACT. So PACT stands for Permanent Affordability Commitment Together. This is a program. We are using the federal RAD program, which was used to convert public housing sites from Section 9 housing to Section 8 housing. The land is still owned by the housing authority, but private developers come in and do the construction work. Often a private manager comes in to take over the site, and they get sort of the ongoing cash flow from the Section 8 vouchers to pay for all of that work. PACT was created in about 2016, I think. The first site was Ocean Bay in Queens. PACT was, I think, desperately needed at the time. They needed some path to funnel investment into those sites. We now have a lot more tools than just PACT, between PACT and the trust. And now what we're thinking about doing at Fulton, Elliott, and Chelsea of rebuilding that site entirely. All of a sudden, we have a much bigger suite of options than just PACT alone. So I think long-term, again, the limitations of PACT is that it keeps the site largely, but perhaps there's more you can do if you actually had a slightly bigger view of what's possible. So I think it's necessary. I think it's worked very well in a lot of places, but I think it's probably not the last thing we're going to end up doing to fix these sites.
Right. So Arvind, we're right at 5 o'clock and we're out of time, but I just want to say thank you again From all of us here at Marywood University School of Architecture, the Center for the Living City, Columbia University. This was fascinating. Everyone, this will be recorded and posted to the center's YouTube video channel. So this was recorded and it'll be posted. Arvind, there are lots more questions. I'm going to save them for you for the Q&A, and maybe you could answer them in all of your free time that you could answer. But I will certainly send them to you so you can see all of the interest that was what was created by this conversation. So I just want to say thank you again to all of our sponsors, and please join us for our next Jane Jacobs lecture, which will be Monday, March 18th. It's For a City Cannot Be a Work of Art, Learning Economics and Social Theory from Jane Jacobs. And that will be presented by Stanford Akita, an economist, and Roberta Brandis-Gratz, author, both on our Center for the Living Cities board. And just want to say thank you, Arvind and Geeta, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.